Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Turn It Off and On Again. Today we're going to be having a bit of a look at an event that happened this week in the news. We saw that there was a major cyber incident breach with Stryker medical group. Unfortunately, they suffered quite a serious cyber breach. Lots of computers were wiped, lots of data was taken. And Intune has been implicated as the attack vector that was used to facilitate these attacks. So I thought it might be a good time to actually have a look at how we can prevent these sort of incidents and these sort of attacks and the steps that you can take with the security that's available to you within Microsoft. Attacker in the middle attacks are often caused because the user is the weakest security area in your organization. They are the weakest link in your security armor. And so we need to make sure that we can protect the user as much as we protect other systems through firewalls, patching, etc. So identity protection really comes into play in these sort of attacks because 99% of them are from that sort of an attack vector. It's the user that is the risk. So let's jump in today and have a look at what we can do. So what can we use to block and prevent these sort of attacks? Well, Microsoft gives us a few different tools. The key aspect, or the number one thing we should be looking at first, is Entra. You must protect the identity. The user is the weak link. They will click on links. They will open up all sorts of things that they probably shouldn't. You can have personal devices. You can have all of this in the mix. So as IT admins, we need to make sure that we lock down the device and the user. Now, we're going to focus up first on the user side of things. So what in Entra do we need to do? There's a few different areas that we can cover, and I have talked about these sort of things before, but multi-factor authentication is non-negotiable. That needs to be in place. But the MFA tokens can still be stolen. And this is where things like Entra P2 come into play because they have user risk and sign-in risk identification features. So we'll now dive in and have a little bit of a look at those particular policy sets and see how they're configured. So I'm going to create a user risk policy. So I'm going to select all users and I'm going to select all resources. For conditions, I'm then going to click user risk and I'm going to configure this yes, configure user risk levels needed for this policy to be enforced. I want medium and I want high risk users. So I want this policy to trigger these two controls. Now, we have a couple of different options. We can either grant access and require MFA, or we can block access. So in this instance, what we would want to do, there's two different ways of thinking about it. Blocking access means that the user is not able to log in. They will need to call for support, help desk, and it would then be on the help desk and support team to actually drill down and work out where this issue is lying for this user. What is probably a more acceptable option is to go grant access, require MFA, and require device to be marked as compliant. So what this is effectively trying to do, we're killing two birds with one stone here. We're trying to make sure that MFA is required so that if the original token or a cache token has been stolen from a machine that had MFA already approved on it, this is forcing that token to be effectively expired and a new one generated. Now, obviously, the hacker or the attacker will not have access to this new token unless they still have a way into this machine. And that is the issue, is does the attacker still have access to either the machine or another way of accessing the device? And so this is where requiring the device to be marked as compliant comes into play. So if they're trying to authenticate from their machine, it's not enrolled in Intune. So this is where we want to require this, we want to require this, and we want to require all of the selected controls. So we go, yep, I understand that my account might be impacted for this, and I hit create. Oh, I've got to give it a name too, don't I? So I'm going to call this user risk. So that policy is now created. The other type is the sign-in risk. So I'm going to create that, and I'm going to go for all users again. Target, I want all resources. Conditions, sign-in risk. So this is what is the risk that this is most likely compromised. So we're going to go yes again. High to medium is normally a fairly good indicator. We go yes, grant. I'm going to actually go block on access on this. So this is a more immediate security issue. So if a sign-in risk is identified, I would rather have the hammer dropped on them and not be allowed into my organization. So I'm going to hit select, and I'm going to go on and create. So that policy is now created. So that's one piece of the protection pie. The other one is we really need to focus on the Intune side of things. So we can see that we've got an MFA policy to look at user risk, sign-in risk, and help that. They require Entra P2. What we need to do now is look at Intune, because if an actor was still able to be in that machine and have access to these tokens, there is potential for them to be able to enroll their device. Even though we've marked it as requiring a compliant device, there is still the potential for them to enroll more devices and enroll that device into the system. So we need to look at a couple of things. We need to look at doing a restriction policy. So we need to restrict the amount of devices that a user is able to log into the system. The other one that we need to look at is actually the Intune compliance policies on the devices as well. So let's look at how they get configured. So we're now in our Intune portal here. So what we want to do is go to devices, enrollment, and then we will want to look at device limit restrictions. So we can see here that the default limit is 5. So we probably want to make a change to that. So we can go device limit, and I'm going to make it 1. So for a Windows device, that is the limit. 1 device is all that users are allowed to enroll. Any more than that, and it will be rejected. You can do the same thing as well to Apple devices. So you can have device limit restrictions. It's restricted to 1 by default. Android, we can have device limit restrictions as well, set to 1. This is really important because you don't want to have more than 1 device enrolled. So if they have 1 phone, if they have 1 computer enrolled, that's great. It means no more can be added, and you're effectively protected from anyone trying to access the organization when they have a require compliant device restriction in place. So this is how, even with Intune, you can help to prevent these attacker in the middle incidents. So let's now have a look at compliance policies and see how they can factor in. So let's jump in and create a compliance policy. So I'm going to create a new one. Windows 10 and later, I'm going to select a Windows 10 11 compliance policy, and I'm going to hit create. I'm going to call this Windows 11 compliance, and then I'm going to put in brackets for required devices, so that we know that we're going to link this policy to the conditional access. Custom compliance, we can have a discovery script or a custom compliance script that we can create there if we want to. But we're going to look at things like the built-in functions, so the ones that we know that we want to have. BitLocker should be a requirement. This will help encrypt the drive and the device and make sure that the data is protected. We want secure boot, so we want to make sure that secure boot is enabled. Device properties, we should have a minimum OS version. So in the versions of Windows 11, let's make it Windows 11 25H2. You want the latest and greatest. Configuration manager compliance, not necessary if you're fully cloud-based. If you're a mixture of on-prem and cloud, then you might be using configuration manager, in which case you may want to tick this box. System security, you can require passwords to unlock these devices. You can force encryption of data storage on the devices. So this is for things like external encryption. Things like device security. We want to make sure firewalls enabled. We want TPM. We want antivirus. We want anti-spyware. We want Defender anti-malware. We want to have all of that information. So we want to make sure that security intelligence is up to date and real-time protection is enabled. Defender for endpoint rules. Do we want to require that the device to be at or under a machine risk score? I would want that machine risk score to be lower. So I'd want it at low or lower. So you would want it to be under that score. And then unlikely you'd be using Windows Subsystem for Linux. But this is a fairly reasonable template of what you would want to create. Actions for non-compliance. You would select mark device non-compliant. Scheduled days after non-compliance, you would want it to happen immediately. You can then add extra controls in there. So things like sending an email to an end user. So you can notify the user or you can notify an admin if that was to go wrong and something was out of date. Scope tags again, you would want it assigned to all devices. We hit next, we hit create, and now this compliance policy is in place. So now that this is a stricter policy, the Entra compliance policy where we have, or the box that we've ticked to require compliance, we'll look at this. Devices need to meet this. If they fall short of that requirement, then they will be not denied access into our organization. So there you have it. There is some basic ways that you can help reduce attack vectors into your organization. Intune is a very robust and a very secure platform. One of the main ways it can be breached is through user intervention, global admins who have access. And that's something else that we should talk about, is that you need to restrict who has admin privileges or admin access into your organization. Users should never be using the same account for administration as they are for their general everyday use. Admin accounts should be more heavily restricted and more heavily controlled. Required compliant devices. All of these things we've talked about today are a minimum for all users. For admins, it should be even stricter. But even if you have at a minimum these protections in place for all users, then you're in a much better position. For admin accounts, you really should be using things like phishing resistant MFA, which even goes an extra step further. So that's using things like YubiKeys, that's using things FIDO2 authentication, hello for business, those types of things, the biometrics, the things that, can't be physically compromised or taken. Those are your best ways to protect admin accounts from being compromised in an organization. So to recap on what we've talked about today, that's identity protection, making sure that MFA policies requiring compliant devices are in place. And if you have Entra P2 licensing or you're wanting to get Entra P2 licensing, then things like user risk and sign-in risk policies are a must as well. The other area is obviously the device protection. So that's limiting your device numbers, taking it down from the default 5 down to 1 for each device type that a user might use in their organization. That again lowers the risk vector for a user to have their device or their account compromised. And then making sure your compliance policies are robust, making sure that you've got TPM protection, BitLocker encryption, you've got all of these things required on the device, and then creating those policies to make sure that that is all in place. So it's not foolproof, but these are one of the ways that you can help prevent these sort of attacks from happening to your business.